The introduction of M1 back in 2020 shifted industry expectations. People were pretty skeptical about Apple ditching Intel for ARM, but M1's unified memory architecture turned out to be a game changer. It was fast, super efficient, and it was an instant hit. Third-party app support was rough at first, but that improved exponentially. And the M1 MacBook Air thrived among students, software devs, and content creators. Its success basically pushed Intel, AMD, and Qualcomm to step up their game. The M1 didn't just change Macs. It changed the whole laptop industry. So here we are, almost 5 years later, with the M4 MacBook Air. It's packed with even more power and better efficiency. So I thought it would be interesting to take a step back and compare M1, M2, and the M3 MacBook Airs to see how the performance has scaled over these past 5 years. If you're still rocking an M1 MacBook Air, you're probably wondering if it's finally time to upgrade. So I'll be testing apps that are familiar with most consumers. I'll also be testing out some photo editing apps and video editing applications, but most importantly, battery life improvements. That's the biggest thing. And I'll also be doing some gaming tests as well. Now, I was lucky enough to snag the refurbished M1 MacBook Air in great condition for about $700 Canadian, which is roughly $490 US. This one's got the M1 chip, 16 gigabytes of memory, and a 256 gigabyte SSD. Now, I'm aware that Apple originally sold the M1 Air with 8 gigabytes of RAM as their base model, but since then they've now doubled that on newer models. So I thought it'd be fair to level the playing field for a proper apples to apples comparison, so the M1 isn't at a disadvantage. From a spec standpoint, the M1 debuted with an 8-core CPU and up to 16 gigabytes of RAM, while M4 now offers a 10-core CPU, support for up to 32 gigabytes of RAM. Graphics has also seen a bit of a boost with newer models featuring up to 10 GPU cores. The memory bandwidth has also nearly doubled on the M4 compared to M1, so it delivers faster data speeds. But that said, the jump from M2 to M3 felt less substantial, with only modest improvements in performance and efficiency, which probably explains the decline in Mac sales around that time period, since people who bought the M1 Air were perfectly happy with their investments, and they just didn't feel the need to upgrade. Now, if we examine the design changes over the past 5 years, I'm going to start with the M1 MacBook Air. This model kept that classic wedge-shaped design. It was slim, it was lightweight, it was 0.63 inches in Z height, and it weighed less than 3 pounds. And while it did feature thicker bezels and fewer ports, the build quality was still solid, and it still currently is pretty amazing, thanks to the aluminum unibody construction. The M1 Air also introduced a fanless design, essentially giving it a completely quiet operation. Again, this is all thanks to that efficiency of M1. Port selection was minimal. You only got 2 Thunderbolt 3 or USB 4 ports, which are still pretty fast at 40 gigabits per second, so it's still relevant, which is great. And on the other side, you got a headphone jack. But if you were a port lover, this wasn't ideal. And I should also point out that the external display support was very limited. You were only able to drive a single display at 6K at 60 Hertz. So it wasn't great for multitaskers, and I know a lot of people were expressing concerns about that. Then came the M2 MacBook Air. Honestly, I don't even know if I'm holding an M2 MacBook Air and an M3 MacBook Air because they all look the same, but the M2 MacBook Air, it brought a complete new redesign, which was inspired by the M1 MacBook Pro. So gone was the wedge shape. It was replaced by a sleeker, boxier design with rounded corners. It was 0.19 inches thinner than the M1 MacBook Air, but it still weighed the same, and it maintained that similar form factor. The bezels shrank, making room for a larger display that also brought some improvements to the table, most notably in the brightness department. So M2 MacBook Air is about 130 nits brighter than M1. The color gamut stayed the same, but Apple did add a notch to house a new 1080p webcam, and it brought a nice visual boost in clarity. You still get the fanless design, and Apple added MagSafe charging. So it's essentially an easier way to attach the power cable. It's magnetic, it's also reversible, and if someone were to yank the cable out, it would prevent any major damages to the laptop. So that was nice. Port selection was still limited to 2 Thunderbolt 3 or USB 4 ports with the same single display limit. Apple also introduced some new colors with the M2 MacBook Air. So I have the Starlight model, but there was also Midnight Blue, which raised a lot of controversies because it scratched up easily around the ports and it was a fingerprint magnet. Now, if we switch over to the interior space, the keyboard and trackpad layouts remain familiar from the M1 MacBook Air to the M2 MacBook Air. You still got the same Touch ID sensor. It's incredibly fast and is super reliable. I've used it to make payments and it's been amazing. The Function Bro now has full height keys, and the Force Touch trackpad continued to set the bar to be one of the best trackpads for a laptop. But if you were to ask me if there was any major upgrades from the M1 to the M2 Air, it has to do with the 4-speaker sound system. So you get 2 tweeters and 2 woofers that are tucked between the keyboard and the display. And surprisingly, this thing delivers incredible sound quality. Clear highs with the touch of bass. It was a day and night difference compared to the M1 MacBook Air. Now later on, Apple did introduce a 15-inch model offering a bigger screen and a larger battery for those craving extra screen real estate and, of course, longer runtimes. It was also faster than the 13-inch model since there was more room to passively cool that processor. The M3 MacBook Air was essentially a spec refresh. It essentially kept the same design ID, except they just added the M3 chip and Wi-Fi 6E support. The port stayed the same, but Apple did add support for 2 5K displays, but with a catch. So the laptop's own display had to be disabled when running those dual displays, which again felt super odd. But now we have the M4 MacBook Air. And well, not a lot has changed. Like seriously, other than the fact that my sample was assembled in Vietnam, whereas the other 3 models I have over here were assembled in China. And I guess the other update is, of course, a new color. So this is sky blue. It's kind of like a neutral, cool silver, but yeah, that's about it. If you care about colors, I guess this is a cool addition, but honestly, that's the least of my concerns. The good news is that for those who use multiple screens, the M4 MacBook Air now supports 2 6K 60Hz displays while still being able to use your main laptop screen, which is awesome. We've been asking this for years with the M1, the M2, and the M3, and I'm finally glad we have it. You also get a slightly bigger battery and an upgraded 12-megapixel center stage webcam. Now this keeps you perfectly centered during video calls, even as you move around. It also has different studio effects like studio lighting, background blur, live reactions that are triggered by gestures. Unfortunately, the display is still stuck at 60 Hz and it's IPS. And that's a bit frustrating. There's no upgrade to 90 Hz or 120 Hz. Honestly, for a laptop in 2025, that's a bit disappointing because the competition in the Windows space is far advanced. So yeah, I'm not sure what's up with that, Apple. So if you're coming from the M1 MacBook Air, the M4 MacBook Air offers a brighter display and improved color accuracy. But if you've been holding out for major design changes, you might be left wanting more. And for those holding to their M2 and M3 models, I just don't see any reason to upgrade to the M4 MacBook Air. Now let's switch gears and talk about some of the performance differences. This is probably the most exciting part for me personally because it highlights just how far Apple Silicon has come over the past 5 years. Before diving in, it is worth noting that all 4 of these MacBook Airs were tested on the latest version of macOS Sequoia 15.3.2 to ensure consistency. In terms of specs, the M1 Air has an 8-core CPU with a 7-core GPU. The M2 Air has an 8-core CPU with a 10-core GPU, similar with the M3 Air. And then we have the M4 Air that has a 10-core CPU paired with a 10-core GPU. And to establish some baseline results, we start with Cinebench 2024, which has native Apple Silicon support. So we ran the 10-minute throttle test as it essentially evaluates how the chip performs over a longer period of time. And the M4 Air comes out 43% faster than M1. What's particularly interesting is how M2 and M3 perform almost identically, possibly due to having the same memory bandwidth, making their verbal gains less noticeable. Moving on to the single core test, the M4 Air takes, again, a massive leap, coming in at 53% faster than M1. This again highlights the significant improvements Apple has made in the clock speed department per core, but also some of the architectural changes as well. Let's switch things up a little bit, okay? I'm gonna try something non-scientific because most users who are buying these MacBook Airs, they aren't pushing these to the limit with heavy workloads. They're using them for everyday tasks like web browsing, organizing data in Excel, creating PowerPoint presentations, and using Microsoft Teams. And of course, watching a ton of videos or content consumption. So how do these laptops handle real-world productivity? Now to test this, I've put together a folder which consists of some Excel sheets, some Word documents, and PowerPoint presentations, and a few 4K videos for the channel. So I'm going to open them simultaneously along with launching Chrome and Microsoft Teams, just to see how each of these Macs handle those applications. And after testing all 4 of them, the results were surprisingly similar. I mean, I didn't notice any delays. Multitasking was super smooth. Everything essentially ran effortlessly. If you look really closely, maybe the M4 might be a fraction of a second faster, but let's be real, you'd only notice that in slow motion, which isn't exactly practical. I think macOS and Apple Silicon handle a lot of the optimizations behind the scenes, so if your workflow falls into this criteria, the M1 Air is still an awesome laptop and it holds up really well. Now, if you push these Macs for demanding workloads, for example, I tested Blender, which is a popular open source 3D creation suite. It's used for modeling, animation, and rendering. And I ran the classroom scene, which is a standard benchmark file that we use for all of our laptop testing. And the M4 Air pulls ahead by a huge margin thanks to those extra CPU cores and the higher clock speeds. I also tested Handbrake by converting a 4K video file to 1080p, and the results were pretty much what you'd expect. The M4 Air was the fastest. But when you switch to GPU accelerated encoding, the gap between all 4 Macs shrunk a lot, which just goes to show that Apple's media engines have been only receiving a few tweaks here and there. Now let's switch over to some creator-based workloads. Now, if you're someone who's maybe thinking about getting into content creation and you want to spend too much money on a MacBook Pro, let's just see how these Macs perform. So I'm going to start with Photoshop, and they have a test called Puget Bench. So this test involves resizing raw images, masking, applying various filters, and the M4 Air completed that task approximately 1 minute and 10 seconds faster than M1, which is a modest difference. Interestingly, M2 and M3 performed nearly identically, showing little variance in speed. Now, this next test is in Adobe Lightroom Classic, so I imported 100 raw photos from my EOSR, applied some edits, and I exported them to JPEG at 100% quality. And the M1 Air took about 1 minute and 20 seconds to export. The M2, M3, and M4 were all about 15 to 30 seconds faster. So the overall performance gain was not particularly significant. Now let's switch to video editing, and let's start with DaVinci Resolve Studio. So this is an 18-minute 4K XAVCS project. We're going to export this to H.265. And the results are actually very interesting. So the M1 Air took about 20 minutes to finish, while M2, M3, and M4 all completed that task in about 15 minutes. So this just highlights that the improvements Apple made to the media engine started with the M2. But after that, the performance has pretty much remained fairly consistent since then. So you're really not getting a huge difference if you're coming from an M2 or an M3. If we switch to Adobe Premiere, this test is exporting an 18-minute project file to H.264. And the M1 Air took about 30 minutes, while M2, M3, and M4 shaved about 10 minutes, which is a decent improvement. So realistically, if you're looking to get a slight boost in video editing, you could technically get away with a refurbished M2 MacBook Air. But I was actually hoping for faster export times with the M4 because it's been almost 5 years. I was hoping for Apple to make some more advancements with the media encode engine, but I guess we're kind of stuck with the same thing. But export times convey one part of the story. What really matters to me is the playback performance within these applications, because ultimately you want to have a smoother editing experience when you're working on any projects. So I tested my DaVinci Resolve project on all 4 of these Macs, and that actually conveyed a very different story. So if you look at the M1 MacBook Air, the playback performance around this portion of the timeline, where I have 2 4K clips along with a couple of text layers, struggles to perform smoothly because it's dropping frames, whereas M2 and M3 get a slight boost, but M4 seems to handle that without a problem. We're getting complete real-time 30 FPS playback. So in the end, while export times aren't significant on all these Macs, the playback experience or the playback performance seems to have improved significantly with M4. So I guess that's a good thing. So the next topic of discussion is gaming on these Macs. Now, let's be real for a sec. None of these Macs are actually built for hardcore gaming. But with Apple Silicon improving year after year, gaming on Mac has become more viable, and we're starting to see more support for this platform. It still has a long way to go in order to keep up with Windows, but just to get a baseline, I was fortunate able to get access to 3D Mark for macOS, which is currently in beta form, but benchmarks are fully native. and they closely match the final release version, which is expected to roll out sometime in the future. So starting with 3D Mark Steel Nomad Lite, which is a test designed to simulate real-world gaming performance on lower power devices. The M4 Air is a massive 113% faster than M1. Moving to 3D Mark Solar Bay, which focuses on ray tracing, and it uses Apple's Metal API, you can see how the performance has scaled over the past 5 years. Again, thanks to that extra GPU cores and the faster memory bandwidth. Now, I was able to run a few games on all of these Macs. So if you like strategy-based games, Baldur's Gate 3 and Total Warhammer 3 ran perfectly fine. Unfortunately, we don't have a reliable way to capture frame rates in macOS, or at least not yet, but instead I ended up loading up the Metal 3 Performance HUD and recorded real-time frame rates using my camera. So in Baldur's Gate 3, the gaming performance across these MacBooks varies, but overall the improvements have been incremental rather than game-changing. One thing to keep in mind is that the M1 Air didn't give me the option to set the resolution to match the rest of the Macs, so it is at a slight advantage since it is running at a low resolution. M4 leads the pack, but if you notice, the pre-time or frame time, which essentially is the amount of time it takes in milliseconds to render each frame, it has seemed to have improved with every generation. Switching to Total Warhammer 3, it tells a completely different story on these Macs, with the M4 Air emerging as the clear winner, delivering 50% better FPS than M1 at the same resolution. I did notice that with the M1, M2, and M3 models, they struggled with inconsistent frame rates, frequently dropping frames, which can lead to noticeable choppiness during the gameplay. So while M1, M2, and M3 hover around 30 frames per second on average, M4 Air is probably the first MacBook that feels genuinely playable without any major compromises. Shifting gears to battery life, all 4 of these laptops show normal battery health, with the M1 Air slightly lower at 94%, so it's still in good condition. In our light load web browsing test, the M1 Air lasted 13 hours, the M2 Air added an extra hour and a half, and the M3 Air extended that by another hour, whereas the M4 Air just saw a significant jump, lasting to about 17 hours. And that's likely due to its larger battery and the improved power efficiency with the silicon. You can see a similar trend with our 4K YouTube playback test, where the M1 Air lasted for about 12 hours, while the M4 Air pushed past 15 hours. So if you like to consume a ton of content, you're going to get a nice boost upgrading from the M1 Air to M4. Now, if you're pushing these chips to their absolute limits, we did run a heavy load test, essentially looping Cinebench 2024. The M4 Air outlasted the rest, while M1 surprisingly surpassed M2 and M3, which makes sense since M1 sips about 8 to 9 watts of power compared to 12 watts with the others. In terms of surface temperatures, the M1 Air runs the coolest, while M2, M3, and M4 reach similar peak temperatures around 47 degrees Celsius, with the heat concentrated in the keyboard's center. So that's a toasty area. I have to say, for a passively cooled setup, these are pretty impressive, and that's just a trade-off you get for an uber silent operation. The bottom covers, on the other hand, stay relatively cool to the touch on all these Macs. It's probably the coolest temp that I've seen on a thin and light laptop. I mean, here's how the M4 Air compares to something like the VivoBook S14 from Asus that I reviewed recently. This thing is actively cooled, and it still manages to get very hot. I managed to run some SSD benchmarks on all these Macs, and to my surprise, M4 was the slowest of them all. I ran it multiple times, but yet I ended up getting less than 3 gigabytes per second, both on read and write performance compared to M1, M2, and M3. I'm not sure as to why that's the case. Maybe they're using a different, cheaper NAND. Again, it's super bizarre. Now, in the real world, you might not notice a huge difference, but again, if you tend to dump a lot of data in and out of these Macs, I feel like the M4 is going to be really slow. So yeah, I am not sure why that's the case, but it's something to keep in mind. And I guess that brings me to the last topic of discussion, which is just the lack of upgradability on these Macs. So the base MacBook Air starts at $999, and you only get a 256 gigabyte SSD. Everything's soldered on. There's no room to access the components, which again makes no sense. I wish there was at least upgradable storage, but we don't get any of that with either of these Macs. So what you configure with these Macs is essentially what you're going to be stuck with. And that's unfortunate. We're starting to see a similar trend with Windows laptops as well, and personally, I am not a huge fan of that transition. So here's the thing. If you're still using the M1 MacBook Air, upgrading to the M4 Air is a compelling move. You get a new chassis, noticeably better battery life, and improved efficiency, all in the same fanless design. And you're getting a much bigger, brighter, and better display. I was actually surprised at how well the M1 Air still holds up for basic tasks. I mean, the M4 makes a big leap in real-world usability, especially if you're pushing the CPU for heavier workloads, and gaming improvements have also been very noticeable. So if you're feeling that itch, go for it. For M2 and M3 Air users, the upgrade makes less sense. M4 is faster, but the gains just aren't as dramatic as they are from M1, unless you specifically need the extra bit of battery life or those extra 2 cores of the CPU, maybe a little bit more GPU power. I feel like it's probably just best to wait. The M4 MacBook Air has been getting a lot of attention lately, and for good reason too, because for $999, you're getting a thin and light laptop that's built incredibly well. It's powered by Apple's latest M4 chip. It also comes with 16 gigabytes of memory. It's something that Apple had to change in order to support Apple Intelligence. But ironically, that feature has been officially delayed. But honestly, it's probably a good thing because Apple just set the bar too high for AI. And because of that, I think we got something good out of it, which was more memory. Otherwise, we'd still be stuck with 8 gigabyte MacBook Airs, which is, I don't think that would sell that well in 2025. So if you're someone who's using the M1 MacBook Air, are you going to upgrade to M4? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. And of course, don't forget to spend responsibly.